Reading is quite a strange phenomenon. We've discovered that when we look at black marks on white paper, that we can hallucinate places, people, scenarios, and conflicts that are so resonant that they can deeply move us and sometimes, oftentimes, reveal profound truths. Rainier Maria Rilke, one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, said that most experiences are unsayable. They happen in a space that no word has ever entered, in Letters to a Young Poet. There's this incredible tension that David Foster Wallace explains perfectly in his incredibly moving speech, This is Water. He says that the most obvious important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. What makes literature so special to me is the fact that sometimes I can see a combination of words that I've read before in a new order that at that point expresses something that I once felt or understood, but never really understood quite so well. For example, when I was younger and going through some harder times, I read Fernando Pessoa's Book of Disquiet. And in the Book of Disquiet, he has this quote: "Everything around me is evaporating. My whole life, my memories, my imagination, and its contents, my personality. It's all evaporating. I continuously feel that I was someone else, that I felt something else, that I thought of something else. What I'm attending here is a show with another set, and the show I'm attending is myself. Never before had I felt so seen and so heard in that moment of my difficulty." The way stories use language to represent the complex nature of the subjective experience within these recognizable or not so recognizable worlds, I believe, is a certain kind of magic. And in this video, I want to posit to you what I think the most important thing that literature has ever brought us, which is that some truths cannot merely be stated directly. They must be represented in order to be meaningful. As such, what we call knowledge has to depend on form and perspective, not just content. And consequently, reading is one of the only technologies that makes that available to us, that makes the world around us deeply intelligible to us. Philosophers since Plato in the 400s BCE have been suspicious of literature as a means of conveying truth. Not only was Socrates suspicious of writing, as he tells us in the Phaedrus and compares it to an orphan child who can't defend itself, but Plato also gives his misgivings with poets and poetry in his famous dialogue, The Republic. Similarly, in 1748 AD, the final passage of An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, Scottish empiricist David Hume basically says that if knowledge or a text doesn't contain philosophical or scientific knowledge, then we ought to commit it to the flames. That's the famous line. But ironically, or deliciously perhaps, Plato only ever wrote dialogues, which the reader has to peruse and find meaning within these dialogues. Many of these dialogues end in aporia. They end unresolved. And at a deeper level, although we know, of course, Socrates was a historical figure, the Socrates that we know and love or hate today is a literary figure. We only have knowledge of him because of Plato's literary creation, this character of Socrates. And Plato credited Homer with being the educator of Greece. And Hume actually loved literature. He said it was one of his ruling passions. In the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, a treatise on logic by Ludwig Wittgenstein, Austrian philosopher, Wittgenstein lays out his theories about optics and truth and perception in numbered and subnumbered propositions. They get really confusing. But why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus has two very important lines relevant to us today. First, Wittgenstein says, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." He and Rilke seem like they're agreeing. There are some things about life that reside in this realm beyond the articulable. However, at the end of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, perhaps its famous or most infamous part, depending on your perspective, Wittgenstein says this: "My propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical. When he has used them as steps to climb beyond them, he must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up on it." So Wittgenstein, who's trying to give us knowledge in this direct propositional way, ends up succumbing to metaphor. Wittgenstein's ladder is a famous philosophical phenomenon, and it's really the thing that most people remember after reading the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, because Wittgenstein's ladder is giving us some important input on how knowledge is being produced. While when we read Kant or Hume or even Wittgenstein, we can see truth operate only when we read whatever favorite novel of yours. Mine could be Fahrenheit 451 or John Williams' Stoner or George Buchner's Lens. Do we feel the resonance of the truth? Do we feel the meaning of things? To put it another way, knowing the sentence is true is very different than understanding the experience of whatever that sentence contains. I think we need to give a brief pause and talk about what I mean when I say meaning. Now, we can get into a lot of philosophical rabbit holes. What a lot of these philosophers do when they talk about meaning, not all of them, but what a lot of them do is sidestep the question and analyze linguistically what meaning means. But that's not what I want to do. I want to define meaning phenomenologically. Phenomenology brings us Martin Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. And following Heidegger, I want to use meaning within the context of how things appear to our consciousness. Being in Time, his magnum opus, is an incredibly complex text, and I'm not trying to reduce it to one thing or another, but I'm just going to use two of his concepts so that we can understand what meaning is. The first being Dasein, the way that we are in the world. Heidegger says that all of our being is being within the world. There's no such thing as understanding our being outside of this world. Even when we're considering abstract ideas, we're still within the worldliness of the world. And in addition to that, he uses the concept of sin, which is an upon which. By that he means that there's a certain configuration of ideas, concepts, things around which our lives have been organized and taken part in that allow us to understand things in certain ways. For example, home or house. When we see a structure in a neighborhood, we don't see a structure in a neighborhood. We see a home, we see a house, we see a place where families live or people live. We see it associated with emotion, good or bad, with liberty or oppression and such. If we follow Heidegger, each writer that's writing comes from their own context. Why is that important? That's important because when we read, we don't just consume, we create. As Robert Piercy argues in Reading as a Philosophical Practice, reading is a vital practice ethically and ontologically, because when we read, especially when we read carefully, we observe the way writers make these worlds similar or dissimilar to our own, and we learn from those gaps and overlaps about ourselves and our reality. Given the oral origins of the Homeric play, it's natural that everything that happens has to be said aloud. Although Achilles is undoubtedly a complex figure who deals with internal conflicts between the tension between his God side and his human side, all of it has to come by way of his actions, whether he kills people or doesn't, whether he takes part in battle or he doesn't. And then, a century later, we have Sappho. She revolutionized the poetic landscape because she moved the idea and the location of meaning inwardly, towards the subjective experience. Plato actually called her the 10th muse in a famous epigram. He said, "Some say the muses are 9, how careless. Look, there's Sappho too, from Lesbos, the 10th. Because of the radical shift she enacted in poetry. Let's look at some illustrative examples. We're going to compare the proem in Homer's Iliad to Sappho's fragment 31. The Iliad translation I'm using is the Fagles one for the cinematic effect, and the Sappho translation I'm using is from Anne Carson. Let's listen to the Homer translation. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses. And then we have the beginning of Sappho's fragment 31. He seems to me equal to the gods, that man, whoever he is, who opposite you sits and listens close to your sweet speaking. While in Homer we have a call, sing, for action, to describe more action, how Achilles murders all the Achaeans, in Sappho we have not only hesitational language with he seems to me, we're not really sure, we're in a space of seems, not is, and he seems to me, the invocation of the first person speaker, the first person narrator. With Sappho, inner life contains and becomes poetry. The location of meaning has shifted towards the subject. Sappho's shift in literature is important because historically, epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, tried to make an ideal of a most removed and abstracted perspective. But as the history of philosophy went on, and as we all learned in 8th grade science, there's such a thing as an observer effect, wherein the presence of the observer inherently changes the nature of the phenomenon that we are observing. So this idea that we could get this perfectly abstract objectivity starts dissolving. My favorite discussion on this topic is Thomas Nagel's A View from Nowhere. Nagel is famous for writing that article, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, wherein he argues that the mind-body problem that Descartes poses in his Meditations on First Philosophy is a lot more complex than materialists think, than people who think that it's just material on material. Because there is something it is like to be a bat, and there is something that it is like to be you. And it's irreducible, he argues, to just material explanations. That's kind of a side note. If you're interested in that article, I'll put it in the description. But in The View from Nowhere, Nagel talks about this tension that we all experience as human beings, in the fact that we all have the perspective of a particular person inside the world, and sometimes an objective view of that same world, the person and his viewpoint included. So we try to, when we make scientific knowledge or something, be as objective as possible, or when we seek truth, but realistically we can never escape the fact that we are these world-bound beings, which is why we started with phenomenology. So Nagel says that an inevitable part of experience is having a view from somewhere, is the fact that we can never truly have a view from nowhere. And mind you, he is not arguing that objectivity is not real or invalid. He actually critiques and argues for objectivity. He's just saying that we are constantly navigating this pull between objectifying things, as in taking things from a broader point of view, a more abstract point of view, and the fact that we are these subjects. I am this person sitting in front of the camera right now. You are the person sitting and watching this video right now. There is something that is irreducible about that fact, even when together we're meditating on these greater ideas. Therefore, following Nagel, we need a subjective perspective as an epistemic condition. What that means is that the subjective experience is a necessary and foundational aspect of our ability to access, negotiate, and understand truth, knowledge, and meaning. And in literature, we see how meaning is constructed between multiple views from somewhere. So I'm going to typify and discuss the varying stages and forms by which literature uses form to show this epistemic plurality, first by discussing Shakespeare, then Dickens, then Faulkner, before we get to postmodernism, where the idea of interpretation itself kind of falls apart. But we will recover there too, so just you wait. So within any of Shakespeare's plays, you're going to get multiple epistemic perspectives occupying the same world, much as we experience in our own world. In Othello, for example, we get multiple perspectives on who is wronging whom. Although in the end, there is a conclusion, a truth of the matter, in this case, Desdemona's innocence, it arises and becomes clear through collision in action. The perspectives are cohabitated in the dramatic space, embodied by these different characters. While perhaps you could understand that jealousy brings people to ruin, Reading Othello or watching Othello shows you much more profoundly how deeply the troubling grooves of misunderstanding can run. The stage creates embodiments of characters who go through the experience of these realizations. The dramatic representations show us this in a peerless way. And it compounds every single time with the lessons that Shakespeare is showing us. We have multiple characters who are both showing and hiding their identities simultaneously, and experiencing or manipulating how actions can make truths intelligible. For example, the strawberry handkerchief. The strawberry handkerchief is a handkerchief that falls out of Desdemona's dress that Othello had given her and said, Desdemona, do not lose this, because if you lose this, things will go bad. And of course, she loses it. This is a tragic play. And Iago finds it and he puts it in Cassio's room. And then he shows Othello, and Othello takes that as a sign that Desdemona is not being loyal to him. Thus, we can see the nuance contained in action's relationship to meaning. But again, this is all through a symbol, not a direct statement, which shows the importance and power of representation as a way of creating knowledge. And as readers and spectators, we kind of get to actually adopt this view from nowhere, because whatever theater or venue we're viewing this from, we kind of are like the gods on Olympus in classic Greek mythology. We're watching from above. The humans undertake their quests and do their things, and we know the truth of the matter, and we can learn from it and do better ourselves, even though not all of the gods do. Which contrasts to the Victorian era novel, like Great Expectations. Pip serves as our unified epistemic center, and he's telling us a story from somewhere. The somewhere is retrospective. So we have that saying, for example, that hindsight is 20/20, because when we look at things in retrospect, we can see the clear narrative arc of how things have brought us to this moment right now. Things that were previously confusing or didn't make sense or felt like an utter loss at that point were plot twists and turns that we can make meaning of once we look at things in a narrative sense, which we all tend to do in our lives. Although his experiences are messy and complex, the truth in Great Expectations is synthesized into one single interpretive frame. Another great example of this is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. We get to watch a narrativization of self in process. We get to watch him wade through the epistemic uncertainty to his point of subjectivity. Because we're understanding meaning only to become intelligible to us within a pre-existing framework of possibilities and purposes, with literature we get to expand that framework by second-handedly observing Othello's mistakes and Pip's lessons. But the sense of resolution breaks when we get to the modernist novel. And by the way, I'm not saying all of the literature from all of these moments is the same. For example, Wuthering Heights, a Victorian-era novel, is a lot more complex in its narrative structure. I actually also wrote my entire literature thesis about how an 1883 novel, albeit having been written during the time of Romanticism, is actually quite anti-romantic and proto-modernistic, and it's one of my all-time favorite pieces of writing in the world. And if you're interested, I'll put the link in the description. And if you're interested in a video about that, let me know in the comments and I'll make one. So anyway, I'm not generalizing. I'm using this narrative, this arc to explain how the movement of literature and its relationship to representation have brought us to the moment where we are today and how it's shifted over time. Okay, so back to the modernist novel. The modernist novel, As I Lay Dying, shows us what happens when this somewhere gets broken down into fragmented perspectives. In this and other modernist novels, there is no single unifying center. Remember, Yeats told us the center cannot hold, and that's what really underscores and underwrites most modernist writing, the sense of collapse and fragmentation. While the coexistence of perspectives may seem on the surface kind of like a drama, kind of like Shakespeare, and in a way there is a parody of the drama present there, it's different because Shakespeare's truths coexist, albeit coming from different sources, whereas Faulkner, the only access to meaning that we get is wading through these discontiguous, fragmented perspectives. So while we may be able to recover a sense of meaning, it's not there in principle. Othello, on the preface, is a tragedy. We understand what kind of meaning we're going to get. We're going to learn some lesson about when things go wrong. Whereas modernism has presupposed that there is this instability that we have to contend with prior to the meaning-making experience. The breakdown of a single authoritative account cannot be meaningfully understood as a claim. It must be experienced as a structure that resists synthesis while still producing some sense of intelligibility. Each of these forms reveal that instances of profound meaning and opportunities for meaning-making are not contained merely in direct statements of truths. Even in fragmentation, there's a world that can be, in principle, interpreted, reconstructed, and pieced back together in a meaningful way, even if it's different from the world that was created in the past. And thus, if that's true, then the majority of knowledge that we gain is from being allowed to experience perspectives through reading, not just from being told. You know that saying, do as I say, not as I do? And how we really don't listen to our parents when they say cheaters never win and winners never cheat, or whatever other banal platitude that contains actually a profound truth but never resonates until you experience it. That's what literature allows us to do without actually experiencing our lover cheating on us and finding their handkerchief in somebody else's room as a proof. That's what Othello can teach us, and that's what literature can teach us. We need to talk about postmodernism. Because if I'm talking about meaning and representation and don't talk about it, perhaps my whole argument collapses in on itself. Because postmodernism rejects the idea that there is this fundamental world about which we can make meaning. So let's go into that. One way it gets put is that modernism emphasizes subjectivity, and postmodernism says that everything, including subjectivity, is relative. But I think that that's the weakest form of interpreting postmodernism, and I don't want to take that route. I'm going to use Infinite Jest as my example for a postmodernist novel, and I'm using it because it's the postmodern novel I've spent the most time with. I've read it twice, and I'm preparing myself for a third read-through, and if you're interested in my thoughts or my takes on Infinite Jest, let me know in the comments, and I can make a video on that in the future. In Infinite Jest, literature no longer offers fragments that can be put into a recoverable whole. The systems of meaning expand so much more quickly than we can totalize them into some kind of meaning. Even the title suggests that, infinite jest, this infinite joke, something without number. We can't comprehend infinity or the fact that it can go infinitely smaller or infinitely bigger. We can rationalize that, but we can never experience that. And even if it's represented to us in some way, it's very difficult to grasp because it's this totally inherently unstable thing. Infinite Jest is, of course, an allusion to Hamlet. It's the line in Hamlet where Hamlet is looking at his court jester's skull that is totally caked in dirt, and he calls Yorick a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy, and says that he hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination it is. That tension that Hamlet conveys there is, I think, pretty important, because Yorick has 1,000 times, many times, innumerable times, brought Hamlet pleasure and happiness and joy. Whereas now we're looking at this skull that Hamlet basically implies makes him want to puke after looking at it. And this thing that used to be deeply meaningful, we're now just faced with the face of death. The death of the meaning of the language, or death of the meaning of the person, the death of all these things, and this brute reality where really there's not much left. I think what postmodernism actually does is pose a new epistemological problem. We've established that there are these different centers of epistemology. There's epistemological plurality that exists in literature throughout different eras, and it manifests itself in different ways through different aspects of literature, because we have these different views from somewhere. And though with modernism, although the somewhere is collapsed, in postmodernism, even the question of somewhere is in question. Instead of representation becoming a vehicle for meaning, representation is part of meaning. It means that meaning was never purported to be delivered in a finished form in the first place. We're making meaning until we die. Every time we pick up a book, we bring a new experience to it. That's why rereading can be such a fruitful experience. Not only because once you've gone through a cursory understanding of the text, you can look more deeply into the text, but every time you bring yourself to the same text, it is no longer the same text, and you're not the same person. As Heraclitus, one of my favorite philosophers, says, no man can ever step in the same river twice. And that's exactly why this direct representation of propositional knowledge, of these static propositions, cannot be the be-all, end-all of meaning making and knowledge creation. Every major transformation of the literary form is an attempt to solve a problem of knowledge in a new way, or advance that problem of knowledge and create more nuance to it. Because once literature recognizes that knowledge is perspectival, it just keeps adding on layers of mediation with modernism and postmodernism. And how do we parse those? Reading. Reading is the answer. Reading is one of the only forms of cognition that does not erase perspective, but enacts it, and allows you to temporarily inhabit a perspective without necessarily identifying with it. I'm thinking here, for example, of Nabokov's Lolita, where our narrator is Humbert Humbert, whom we should not trust. Reading is a structured experience of translating subjective experiences without collapsing them into one single truth. It then is not just the passive reception of meaning, as we talked about. Reading is an act of creation. It's the lived experience of navigating through a system of perspectives that never fully closes. So all I have to say is, read on. If you like this video, check out my other videos, check out my Substack. I write companion essays to each video, as well as different essays and pieces about things in life that I care about or think are important. I also write newsletters every other month for Book 11, a journal of literary philosophy. They will both be linked in the description. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about reading as an act of creation, about this most important idea that literature has brought us, and I hope to see you next time in my next video. And read on.